Frenemies. The summer air was thick, carrying the low thrum of bass-heavy music from a nearby car. Streetlights flickered, casting their yellow glow on the cracked pavement. On the corner, Charles laughed louder than necessary, flashing that practiced grin that seemed to make people believe he was someone to admire. His arms slung lazily around Katrina's shoulders, but his eyes darted to Sylvia every time she leaned in to whisper something conspiratorial to her best friend. Katrina, oblivious, sipped from her red cup, her easy laughter carrying above the music. Tony stood a few steps away, watching the scene with his usual quiet intensity, his cigarette glowing in the dark. His sharp eyes caught everything. The way Sylvia's hand lingered a second too long on Charles's arm when she passed him her drink, and the flicker of something dangerous in Charles's gaze when Katrina wasn't looking. But Tony stayed silent. This wasn't his business. Not yet, anyway. As the night waned, Katrina leaned into Charles, her head spinning. "I don't know why I feel so tired," she mumbled, blinking heavily. "Come on, baby," Charles said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Let's get you home." Sylvia smirked, a flicker of something wicked flashing across her face. "I'll come too," she said quickly, her eyes darting to Charles. "I could use some water before heading back." Tony shrugged. "Guess I'll crash at y'all's spot. Too much going on out here." Back at the apartment, Katrina excused herself for a shower, murmuring about how strange she felt. The steam billowed around her as she leaned against the wall, trying to shake the fog clouding her mind. Meanwhile, Tony stretched out on the couch, pulling his cap low over his face. Sylvia lingered in the kitchen, fiddling with the fridge door, while Charles stood in the doorway watching her. "You're bold. You know that?" he murmured, his tone half warning, half admiring. Sylvia tilted her head, her smile slow and deliberate. "And you love it." Their conversation halted as Katrina emerged from the bathroom, her damp hair clinging to her neck. She stepped into the bedroom, finding Charles and Sylvia standing too close. Charles held a pair of folded pajamas in his hand. "What's going on?" Katrina asked, her voice wary but soft. "Just getting Syl something to sleep in," Charles said smoothly, handing the clothes to Sylvia. Katrina blinked at him, her exhaustion overtaking her suspicion. "I feel off," she murmured, swaying slightly. "It's just the drinks," Charles said, guiding her to bed. He brushed her hair back from her face with a gentleness that made her eyes flutter shut. "Sleep it off, baby. I got you." Katrina woke suddenly, her throat dry and her mind still clouded. She reached for Charles, but her hand landed on his phone, not his body. Frowning, she pushed herself out of bed. The soft glow of the kitchen light spilled into the dark hallway. She called out for him 3 separate times, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Charles?" No answer. She stepped into the kitchen and froze. Sylvia stood by the sink, her back to Katrina, wearing nothing but a bra and boy shorts. Charles leaned casually against the counter, holding a half-eaten sandwich like it was any other night. His shirt was crumpled and his belt dangled loosely around his waist. "What the hell is going on?" Katrina demanded, her voice sharp now. Charles looked up, his expression unreadable. "Babe, what are you doing up? You should be resting." "Resting?" Katrina's voice cracked. "Why is she half naked in my kitchen?" Sylvia turned, feigning indignation. "I came to get water and he just walked in after me." "Don't start acting crazy, Katrina." Katrina's hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare call me crazy. This doesn't look like nothing." Charles stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Katrina, go back to bed. You're tired and you're tripping." "It's not what it looks like." Sylvia grabbed her purse, muttering, "This is ridiculous. I'm out." She brushed past Katrina, not meeting her eyes. Morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows as Katrina scrubbed the counters with a vengeance, her music blaring. She hummed softly, trying to shake the unease from the night before, but when she opened the microwave to clean it, her breath hitched. A used condom hung from the power cord, its presence mocking her. Her stomach turned. She snatched her phone and dialed Sylvia. It rang, then went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Heart pounding, she called Charles. He picked up after 2 rings, his voice sharp. "What is it, Katrina? I'm busy." She hesitated. "I found something, a condom, in the microwave." There was a beat of silence before he laughed, low and dismissive. "You're wild. Who would do that? Stop imagining things. Clean it up and chill out." "But Katrina," he interrupted, his tone firm. "I don't have time for this. Stop acting crazy." And just like that, the doubt crept in. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Charles strode down the block later that morning, his swagger measured, his confidence unshaken. Tony walked beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood. The block was waking up slowly, people dragging folding chairs onto porches, kids shouting as they chased each other. "You good?" Tony asked, lighting a cigarette. His tone was casual, but his eyes were searching. "Always," Charles replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Tony exhaled smoke, watching his friend. "Katrina was tripping last night." You do something to set her off? Charles shrugged, brushing imaginary lint off his crisp white tee. You know how women are, always looking for something to complain about. Tony didn't respond immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make Charles glance at him. You sure that's all it was? Charles chuckled, a low sound that bordered on irritation. Man, you act like you don't know me, I got this. Tony's lips twitched into a faint smirk. Yeah, I know you. That's why I'm asking. Back at the apartment, Katrina scrubbed harder than necessary, her playlist shifting to slow jams that only amplified her mood. Her mind replayed the events of the night before in excruciating detail. Sylvia's smug expression, Charles's dismissive tone. Why hadn't Sylvia answered her call? Sylvia always picked up, always had some messy story to tell, some guy to laugh about. The silence was deafening. By mid-afternoon, Katrina gave up cleaning and decided to go to Sylvia's apartment. When she arrived, she knocked, her hand trembling slightly. Sylvia answered the door, her face blank but her makeup flawless, as though she'd been expecting someone. "What's up, girl?" Sylvia said, her voice dripping with forced cheer. She leaned against the doorframe, blocking Katrina's view inside. Katrina tilted her head, trying to peek around her. "You didn't answer my calls? What's going on?" Sylvia laughed, a hollow sound. "My phone's been acting up. You know these cheap phones don't last long." Katrina frowned. "I found a condom in my microwave sill. I called you because—" Her voice trailed off as she searched Sylvia's face for a flicker of guilt, a crack in the facade. Sylvia's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely shocked. Then she laughed again, shaking her head. "A condom? In your microwave? Girl, Charles must be playing games with you." Katrina's stomach twisted. The words sounded plausible, but something about Sylvia's tone felt off. "Yeah, maybe," Katrina said, her voice soft. That evening, Tony and Charles sat on the stoop sipping beers. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting a dim glow on their faces. "You ever think about settling down for real?" Tony asked, his tone casual, but his eyes fixed on Charles. Charles snorted. "What's the point? Women want too much, and half of them ain't worth the trouble." Tony shook his head slowly, taking a swig from his bottle. "Katrina ain't like that. She's solid. You messin' with her head, though. That's dangerous." Charles's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone light. "You sound like her dad or something. Relax." Tony leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You think she's blind, but women see more than you give them credit for. You playing a game that might blow up in your face." Charles smirked, brushing him off. "Ain't no game, man. I got everything under control." Tony didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on Charles, as though he were memorizing a man about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Days passed, and Katrina tried to shake the gnawing feeling in her gut, but then she found another used condom, this time tucked behind the couch cushion. She stared at it and felt a wave of rage building up. She didn't call Sylvia this time. She didn't even call Charles. She waited. That night, when Charles walked through the door, whistling like he didn't have a care in the world, Katrina was sitting at the kitchen table. The condom was in a sandwich bag, placed neatly in the center of the table. Charles froze, his smile slipping. "What's this?" "You tell me," Katrina said, her voice cold. Charles laughed, though it sounded forced. "You think I know? You really think I'd be dumb enough to leave that around if I was up to something?" "You tell me," she repeated, her eyes locking onto his. Charles sat down across from her, his face a mask of calm. "Baby, come on. You're stressing yourself out over nothing. This isn't healthy." Katrina's resolve wavered, his smooth words working their usual magic. But then she thought about Sylvia, about the looks, about the excuses. Her voice cracked as she asked, "Are you cheating on me?" Charles leaned back, spreading his arms. "Katrina, if I was cheating, don't you think you'd know by now? Stop letting these little things get in your head. It's just me and you, baby." For the next week, Katrina moved like a ghost through the apartment. She cleaned obsessively, replaying every conversation, every glance, every gut feeling she had ignored. Charles, meanwhile, acted as if nothing was amiss. His charm was turned up to full volume, greeting her with flowers one day, cooking her dinner the next, but Katrina wasn't blind anymore. She began paying attention, watching his phone when it buzzed, noting his tone when he spoke to her versus how he spoke to Sylvia. The little details she once brushed off now screamed for her attention. Sylvia kept her distance, which only added to Katrina's suspicion. Sylvia was the kind of friend who popped up unannounced, always inserting herself into Katrina's life. Her absence now felt like an admission of guilt. Tony found himself caught in the middle. He had always been loyal to Charles, but Katrina's quiet pain was starting to bother him. One afternoon, as they sat in Tony's car, Charles casually recounted his latest excuse to brush Katrina off. Tony, leaning against the steering wheel, finally spoke up. You ever think you're taking her for granted? Tony's tone was calm, but his words were sharp. Charles raised an eyebrow. What's this about? Look, I'm your boy, so I'm going to keep it real with you. Katrina's solid. Most women would have kicked you out by now. But you're out here acting reckless. You think she's going to keep putting up with this? Charles waved him off. Man, Katrina loves me. She's not going anywhere. Tony shook his head, muttering under his breath. Don't say I didn't warn you. Unable to stay silent any longer, Katrina decided to confront Sylvia. She showed up at Sylvia's apartment unannounced. Sylvia opened the door, her face a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Katrina, what's up? Katrina didn't bother with pleasantries. I know something's going on between you and Charles. Don't lie to me. Sylvia stiffened but quickly recovered, her laugh forced. Girl, you sound crazy. Me and Charles? You really think I'd do that to you? Katrina stepped inside, her eyes narrowing. Yes, I do, because lately you've been acting real different. And I'm not stupid, Sylvia. I've seen the way you look at him. Sylvia crossed her arms, her tone turning defensive. Maybe if you weren't so insecure, you wouldn't be imagining things. Charles loves you. If he wanted me, trust me, he'd have already had me. The words hit harder than Katrina expected. She stared at Sylvia, her chest heaving with anger. You're lying, and if I find out you're not, you better watch your back. Sylvia smirked, stepping closer. Watch my back? Girl, focus on keeping your man. That's your real problem. The next morning, Katrina was determined to catch Charles in the act. She waited until he was in the shower and grabbed his phone. It was password protected, but she had watched him unlock it countless times. Her hands trembled as she entered the code. The messages were there, plain as day. Sylvia, last night was wild. You sure she didn't hear us? Charles, she was knocked out. You worry too much. Katrina's heart stopped. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She scrolled further, reading texts that made her stomach churn. When Charles emerged from the bathroom, towel draped around his waist, she was waiting for him. Who's wild? And what didn't I hear? Katrina's voice was ice. Charles froze, his eyes flicking to his phone in her hand. For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw panic flash across his face, but then it was gone, replaced by his usual arrogance. Why are you going through my phone? He demanded, snatching it from her hand. Why are you sleeping with Sylvia? She shot back, her voice cracking. Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his back, scrolling through his phone to see how much she had seen. You're blowing this out of proportion, he finally said. Katrina laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. Out of proportion? I read the messages, Charles. I know everything. Don't insult me by lying. Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I messed up, okay? But it didn't mean anything. You and me, that's real. Sylvia was just a distraction. A distraction? Katrina's voice rose. You're disgusting. Later that day, Tony found Charles sitting on the stoop, his head in his hands. What's going on? Tony asked, sitting down beside him. Charles groaned. Katrina found out about Sylvia. Tony's jaw tightened. So it's true? You were messing with her best friend? Charles looked at him, guilt and defiance warring on his face. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Sylvia came on to me and, I don't know. I couldn't say no. Tony shook his head, disgusted. You've really outdone yourself this time. You're about to lose a good woman over some stupid fling. Charles didn't respond, staring blankly at the sidewalk. Katrina didn't come home that night. She stayed at a cousin's place, ignoring Charles's calls and texts. The next morning, she showed up at the apartment with Sylvia in tow. Sylvia looked sheepish, but her defiance was gone. Katrina had clearly confronted her, and whatever was said had left Sylvia rattled. Charles tried to smooth things over, but Katrina cut him off. I'm done, she said simply, her voice steady. You can have Sylvia. You two deserve each other. Sylvia opened her mouth to speak, but Katrina shot her a look that silenced her. And just like that, Katrina walked out, leaving Charles and Sylvia standing in the wreckage of what they had created. As the door slammed, Sylvia gave Charles a slight smirk, then moved in closer to him and whispered in his ear, Now we don't have to hide. I'm about to go get a drink, Charles replied back. I'll meet you there, Sylvia said, wearing that same smirk. A few hours later, Sylvia pulled up on the block, holding in hand her personal bottle, both acting like nothing even happened, both sharing flirtatious smiles and touches. When the night waned down, Charles took Sylvia home with him. Sylvia wasn't just sleeping with Charles. She had been harboring feelings for him since before he even met Katrina. In fact, it was Sylvia who introduced Charles to Katrina in a twisted attempt to keep him close while hiding her obsession. After Katrina left Charles, Sylvia wormed her way further into his life. She began showing up uninvited, cooking for him, cleaning his apartment, and leaving traces of herself around, clothes in his closet, toiletries in his bathroom. Charles allowed it at first, thinking it was harmless. One night, as Sylvia lay in his bed, she whispered, "You know we're meant to be together, right?" Katrina was just in the way. Charles froze, realizing for the first time how far Sylvia's delusions had gone. "What are you talking about?" "I've always loved you, Charles," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "I waited for you to see it. I thought you did that night, but you're still holding on to her." Charles sat up, suddenly uneasy. "Sylvia, we were never a thing. You need to let this go." Her face darkened. "You don't mean that. I gave up everything for you. Katrina, our friendship, my reputation, everything." Charles stood, his voice rising. "You gave up everything because you wanted something that wasn't yours. That's on you." Sylvia stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "You'll regret this." Katrina wasn't done with Sylvia. She couldn't shake the feeling that Sylvia's betrayal went deeper than just sleeping with Charles. One day, while scrolling through old photos, she came across a picture from the night she met Charles. Sylvia was standing off to the side, watching them with an expression Katrina now recognized as jealousy. Determined to get answers, Katrina dug through old messages and found a thread from Sylvia around the time she started dating Charles. Sylvia: "He's great, but don't get too attached. Guys like him never settle down." Sylvia: "You should be careful. I've heard things about him." Katrina's hands shook as she read the messages. Sylvia had been planting doubts in her mind from the beginning. Fueled by rage, Katrina confronted Sylvia at her job, bursting into the boutique where Sylvia worked. "You've been playing me this whole time, haven't you?" Katrina yelled, her voice echoing in the quiet store. Sylvia looked up from behind the counter, her face pale. "Katrina, what are you doing here?" "Don't play dumb. I know you've been after Charles from the start. You never wanted me to be happy." Customers turned to watch, their eyes wide with curiosity. Sylvia glanced around, trying to maintain her composure. "Let's talk about this somewhere else." "No, we're talking about it here," Katrina snapped. "You're a snake, Sylvia. You ruined everything." Sylvia's mask slipped, her voice dripping with venom. "And what if I did? You were too blind to see it anyway. Charles was never yours. He's always been mine." Katrina lunged at her, and the two had to be separated by store security. Tony had always seemed like the loyal best friend, but he had his own secrets. Unbeknownst to Charles, Tony had a history with Sylvia. Years ago, they had a brief fling that ended badly when Sylvia accused him of using her. Now, seeing the chaos Sylvia had caused, Tony decided it was time to expose her. He met with Katrina at a coffee shop and laid everything out. "Sylvia's been playing both sides," Tony said, sliding his phone across the table. Katrina scrolled through texts between Tony and Sylvia, her eyes widening. Sylvia had tried to rekindle things with Tony while she was still sleeping with Charles. "She's not just after Charles," Tony continued. "She's a manipulator. She thrives on drama and tearing people down." Katrina clenched her fists. "She's not getting away with this." Despite everything, Charles still found himself drawn to Sylvia. Her toxic allure was impossible to ignore, and one night, after too many drinks, he let her back into his bed. The next morning, Tony walked in unannounced to find them tangled together. "Are you serious right now?" Tony yelled, slamming the door behind him. Charles bolted upright, scrambling for his clothes. "Tony, it's not what it looks like." "Don't even try that," Tony snapped. "You're just proving you'll never change." Sylvia smirked, lounging in the bed as if she owned it. "Jealous, Tony?" Tony ignored her, turning to Charles. "You've hit rock bottom, man. Don't call me when this blows up in your face." The tension reached a boiling point one night at a block party. Sylvia, Katrina, Charles, and Tony all found themselves in the same space, the air thick with unresolved issues. Sylvia approached Katrina, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Enjoying the party?" Katrina ignored her, but Sylvia pushed further. "You should thank me. If it weren't for me, you'd still be living a lie." Katrina turned, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't want to do this, Sylvia." "Why not? Afraid I'll tell everyone how you couldn't keep your man?" Sylvia taunted. Before anyone could stop her, Katrina threw her drink in Sylvia's face. Sylvia retaliated, and the two women were soon in a full-blown fight, surrounded by a shouting crowd. Charles and Tony rushed in to break it up, but not before Katrina screamed, "You can have him! He's just as worthless as you are!" As the crowd dispersed, a neighborhood elder approached Tony, pulling him aside. "You need to tell her," the elder said, nodding toward Katrina. "Tell her what?" Tony asked, confused. The elder sighed. "That Sylvia ain't just after Charles. She's been messing with someone else too, someone close to you." Tony's heart sank as he realized the elder was talking about his younger brother, who had been acting strangely distant lately. Tony couldn't shake the elder's words. That night, he confronted his younger brother, Marcus, who had been avoiding him for weeks. "Marcus, we need to talk, now," Tony demanded, cornering him outside their mother's house. Marcus hesitated, looking anywhere but at his brother. "What's this about?" "Don't play dumb. Someone told me you've been messing around with Sylvia. Is it true?" Marcus froze, guilt written all over his face. I didn't know she was with Charles, too. She told me it was over between them." Tony clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "You knew she was bad news. How could you get involved with someone like that?" "She came on to me," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "She said she needed someone who actually cared about her, not someone who treated her like trash." Tony stormed off, his mind racing. Sylvia wasn't just toxic. She was a calculated saboteur, targeting everyone around her to maintain control. Meanwhile, Charles found himself spiraling further. With Tony cutting him off, Katrina gone, and Sylvia becoming more unhinged, he had no one to turn to. He started drinking heavily, missing work, and gambling away what little money he had left. One night he received a text from an unknown number. "You've got 48 hours to pay up, or we're coming for you." Charles stared at the message, his heart pounding. He'd borrowed money from a neighborhood loan shark weeks ago to cover his gambling debts, thinking he'd win it back quickly. But now the clock was ticking. Desperate, he called Sylvia, who answered on the third ring. "What do you want, Charles?" she said, her tone cold. "I need help," he admitted. "I'm in deep and I don't know what to do." Sylvia laughed bitterly. "Help? After you let everyone turn on me? You're on your own." The next block party became the stage for an all-out showdown. Katrina, Tony, Charles, Sylvia, and even Marcus were all there, each carrying their own grievances. A man stepped out of the shadows holding a gun. It was the loan shark Charles owed money to. "Charles, time's up," the man growled. Panic spread through the crowd as people scrambled to get away. Charles raised his hands, trying to talk the man down. "Look, I just need more time." "No more time," the loan shark said, aiming the gun at Charles. Before he could pull the trigger, Tony tackled the man to the ground. The gun went off, the bullet grazing Tony's arm. Chaos erupted as police sirens wailed in the distance. The loan shark and Charles were arrested, and Tony was taken to the hospital, where he received stitches for his wound. Katrina stayed by his side, grateful for his bravery. Charles was sentenced to 6 months in jail, giving him time to reflect on his choices. Meanwhile, Katrina and Tony grew closer, their bond strengthening as they supported each other through the chaos. Katrina and Tony found themselves spending more time together, the shared trauma of their recent experiences drawing them closer. Late nights talking turned into long embraces, and soon those embraces became something more. One evening, after a particularly emotional conversation about Sylvia's latest antics, Katrina poured them both a glass of wine. Tony, sitting on the couch, looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You've been through hell," he said, his voice low, "but you're stronger than you think." Katrina gave a soft laugh, trying to deflect. "You sound like a motivational poster." "I'm serious," Tony said, moving closer. "You're amazing, Katrina. You deserve someone who sees that." Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was full of urgency and unspoken desire. She hesitated for a moment, then gave in, pulling him closer. The next morning, Katrina woke up tangled in sheets and guilt. Tony was still asleep beside her, his arm draped across her waist. She slipped out of bed quietly, heading to the kitchen to make coffee and clear her head. "What am I doing?" she thought, staring at the steam rising from her mug. Tony joined her a few minutes later, shirtless and relaxed. "Morning," he said, leaning against the counter. "Morning," she replied, avoiding his gaze. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. "Don't overthink it. We're two grown people enjoying each other's company. That's all it has to be." Katrina nodded, grateful for his understanding. But deep down, she knew her heart was still tied to Charles, no matter how much she wanted to move on. As Katrina and Tony's casual relationship continued, whispers began circulating in the neighborhood. Sylvia had been spotted visiting Charles in jail. At first, Katrina brushed it off as idle gossip, but her curiosity got the better of her. One day, while out running errands, she overheard two women talking outside the corner store. "Can you believe Sylvia's still messing with Charles?" one said. "Girl, she's been up there every week. You know they're doing more than just talking," the other replied, laughing. Katrina felt her stomach drop. That night, she confronted Tony. "Have you heard anything about Sylvia visiting Charles?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Tony frowned. Yeah, I've heard, but I didn't want to tell you. I figured you'd already had enough to deal with. Well, now I know, Katrina said bitterly. Unbeknownst to Sylvia, Charles's time in jail had taken a horrific turn. Shortly after his arrival, he had been targeted by a group of inmates who saw him as weak. They cornered him in the showers one night, and what followed was a brutal violation that left Charles broken and ashamed. He never reported the incident, fearing retaliation and humiliation. Instead, he buried the trauma, telling himself he'd survive and get out soon. But the damage had already been done. Months later, during a routine medical checkup, Charles was told he had tested positive for HIV. He was stunned, unable to process the diagnosis. You need to start treatment immediately, the prison doctor said. But Charles refused to believe it. He convinced himself it was a mistake, that there had been some mix-up with the test results. He never told Sylvia or anyone else. Katrina couldn't let go of the idea that Sylvia was visiting Charles. Her feelings for him were still raw, and the thought of him moving on with Sylvia felt like another betrayal. One weekend, she decided to see for herself. She drove to the jail during visiting hours and waited in the parking lot. Sure enough, Sylvia arrived, dressed to impress and carrying a bag that left little to the imagination about its contents. Katrina felt a mix of anger and heartbreak as she watched Sylvia walk inside. That evening, she confronted Tony again. Sylvia's still manipulating him. She's going to ruin his life even more than it already is. Tony sighed. Charles has to want to change Katrina. You can't save him. But Katrina couldn't let it go. What Katrina didn't know was that Sylvia's visits weren't entirely about love. She had discovered Charles's vulnerability and saw an opportunity. She was siphoning money from him, convincing him to sign over what little he had left in exchange for her love and loyalty. But Sylvia was also reckless. She didn't know about Charles's diagnosis, and her visits included unprotected sex. After seeing Sylvia waltz into the prison like she owned the place, Katrina became consumed with uncovering the truth about their relationship. She spent hours stalking Sylvia's social media, analyzing every post for clues. One night, she couldn't resist any longer and called Charles from Tony's burner phone, masking her number. "Who is this?" Charles asked, his tone suspicious. "It's me, Katrina," she said softly. Charles paused. "What do you want?" "I saw Sylvia visiting you," she said bluntly. "Are you two together now?" Charles chuckled coldly. "Why do you care? You've got Tony to keep you warm, don't you?" "That's not the point," Katrina snapped. "After everything, you're still letting her manipulate you." "She's the only one who's been here for me," Charles said, his voice bitter. "You didn't even write me a letter, Katrina, so don't act like you care now." Katrina felt the weight of his words, but couldn't shake the feeling that Charles was lying. As Katrina's obsession with Charles grew, her relationship with Tony became more strained. They continued sleeping together, but the emotional intimacy started to fade. One evening, after another argument about Charles, Tony finally snapped. "You're still in love with him, aren't you?" Tony demanded. Katrina looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't get it," Tony said, pacing the room. "The man treated you like trash. I've been here, trying to help you move on, and you're still hung up on him." "I can't explain it," Katrina said, tears in her eyes. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't just turn my feelings off." Tony shook his head. "Maybe I'm the fool for thinking I could be enough." Before Katrina could respond, Tony grabbed his jacket and left. Sylvia was riding high on the thrill of controlling Charles. She visited him weekly, bringing him gifts and promises of a future together once he got out. But she underestimated how much control she truly had over him. One visit, she pressed him for more money. "I need you to sign this," she said, sliding a piece of paper across the table. Charles glanced at it. "What's this?" "It's just so I can access some of your accounts," Sylvia said sweetly. "You know, to keep things running while you're in here." Charles's eyes darkened. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're not here because you love me, Sylvia. You're here because you're a leech." Sylvia's face twisted in anger. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I've been the only one coming to see you." "Yeah, and that's because you're scheming," Charles spat. "I may be down, but I'm not stupid." The guards intervened before the argument escalated, and Sylvia stormed out, humiliated. Sylvia, furious and desperate, decided to get revenge on Katrina and Tony. She spread rumors around the neighborhood, insinuating that Katrina was only sleeping with Tony to make Charles jealous. "She's playing him like a violin," Sylvia told anyone who would listen. "She doesn't care about him. She just wants to hurt Charles." The gossip spread quickly, and it wasn't long before it reached Tony. Tony showed up at Katrina's apartment unannounced one night, his expression hard. Why is everyone saying you're using me to get back at Charles? He demanded. Katrina was caught off guard. What? Who's saying that? You know damn well who, Tony said. Sylvia's been running her mouth all over the block. That's not true, Katrina said, her voice rising. You know me better than that, Tony? Do I? He asked, his tone dripping with doubt. Katrina stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his chest. Tony, I care about you, I swear I do. But I'm still figuring things out. Can't you understand that? Tony sighed, his anger softening. I don't know, Katrina. Maybe I'm just tired of being the rebound guy. Katrina looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. You're not a rebound to me. They stood in silence for a moment before Tony finally said, I need some time to think. Sylvia wasn't done yet. She began visiting Tony, pretending to be remorseful for her past actions. I've made mistakes, she said one afternoon, showing up at his job unannounced. But I'm trying to change. I need someone to talk to. Tony, still reeling from his fight with Katrina, reluctantly let her in. Over the next few weeks, Sylvia wormed her way into Tony's life, using his vulnerability to her advantage. She fed him lies about Katrina and Charles, planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Katrina, unaware of Sylvia's manipulation, decided to visit Charles one last time to get closure. When she arrived at the prison, she was shocked to see Sylvia leaving. You're still here? Katrina said, her voice dripping with disdain. Sylvia smirked. Of course. Charles and I have a bond you'll never understand. Katrina clenched her fists, holding back the urge to lash out. You're pathetic, Sylvia. No, sweetie, Sylvia said, stepping closer. What's pathetic is you still chasing after a man who doesn't want you. Katrina watched Sylvia walk away, her mind racing. That night, Tony confronted Katrina again, this time with a cruel edge. You're still running to Charles, aren't you? He accused. I went to get closure, Katrina said defensively. Closure? Tony laughed bitterly. Or are you just hoping he'll take you back? Katrina's heart sank. Tony, please don't do this. No, he said, shaking his head. I'm done being your second choice. As Tony walked out, Katrina felt her world crumbling. 2 months had passed, and life in the projects had become a chaotic tangle of secrets and shifting alliances. Katrina had been avoiding Tony, unsure of how to break the news to him. Sylvia, on the other hand, was eager to flaunt her power over Charles, even if it was rooted in a pregnancy she hadn't entirely planned for. One evening, after pacing her tiny apartment for what felt like hours, Katrina finally worked up the courage to tell Tony. He arrived looking tired but relaxed, holding a bag of takeout. What's up? He asked, setting the food down on the counter. Katrina bit her lip, wringing her hands. I need to tell you something. Tony froze mid-reach for the bag. That doesn't sound good. It's not bad, Katrina said quickly. At least I don't think it is. He turned to her, his expression cautious. Just say it. I'm pregnant, she blurted out, her voice trembling. Tony's eyes widened, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then a smile crept onto his face. Are you serious? She nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. Yeah. Tony pulled her into a tight hug, his joy palpable. But as they pulled apart, his expression shifted. Is it mine? He asked hesitantly. Katrina's heart sank. Of course it's yours, Tony. There hasn't been anyone else since, you know. He nodded, but the shadow of doubt lingered in his eyes. Okay, I believe you. But I gotta ask, where's your head at with all this? Are you still thinking about Charles? Katrina hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I'm with you, Tony. I'm trying to move forward. Tony nodded, though her words didn't completely ease his worries. Sylvia strutted into the prison visitation room wearing a tight dress that hugged her growing belly. Charles, dressed in his standard orange jumpsuit, sat with a grim expression, tapping his fingers on the table. Guess what? Sylvia said, sliding into the chair across from him. What now? Charles asked, already irritated. I'm pregnant, Sylvia said, leaning back with a smug smile. Charles stared at her, his jaw tightening. You're sure it's mine? Sylvia's smile faltered. Of course it's yours. Don't insult me. Charles leaned back, running a hand over his face. This isn't exactly great timing, Sylvia. Well, you should have thought about that before we started hooking up, Sylvia snapped. I don't know what you expected, Charles. He sighed, staring at the table. I'll take care of the kid, but don't think this means we're some happy little family. Sylvia crossed her arms. You're getting out next week, right? What's your plan? Charles shrugged. Figure it out when I'm out. I've got bigger things to worry about than playing house with you. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. You're such an ass, you know that? Charles smirked. And you're just figuring that out now? As the days counted down to Charles's release, Tension in the neighborhood grew. Word spread quickly that he was coming back, and everyone had an opinion about it. Katrina tried to focus on her pregnancy and her relationship with Tony, but the thought of Charles being back on the streets sent her emotions into overdrive. She couldn't help but wonder if seeing him again would reignite old feelings. Meanwhile, Sylvia was plotting. She saw Charles's impending release as an opportunity to solidify her place in his life. She began dropping hints to their mutual friends about how they were starting a family, hoping to force his hand. Tony, on the other hand, became increasingly wary. He knew that Charles's return would complicate things between him and Katrina. The day Charles walked out of prison, the air felt electric. Dressed in fresh clothes Tony had dropped off for him, he stepped out into the sunlight, his face a mixture of relief and determination. Sylvia was waiting for him, leaning against a car she'd borrowed, her belly slightly more pronounced than the last time he'd seen her. "Welcome back," she said, opening the passenger door for him. Charles climbed in without a word, staring out the window as she drove. "You're not even going to say thank you?" Sylvia asked, annoyed. "For what?" he said flatly. "Playing chauffeur?" Sylvia glared at him. "For holding you down while you were locked up." Charles snorted. "Yeah, thanks for that." Later that day, Charles showed up at Katrina's apartment unannounced. She opened the door, stunned to see him standing there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Can't I stop by and say hi?" Charles said, leaning against the doorframe. Tony's voice called from inside. "Who is it, Katrina?" Charles smirked. "Let me guess, Tony's playing house with you now?" Katrina stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "This isn't the time, Charles." "It's never the time with you, is it?" he said, his tone biting. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, hoping to shock him into silence. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Tony's kid?" "Yes," Katrina said firmly. Charles nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Good for you. Guess you've moved on after all." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Katrina standing on the stoop, her heart pounding. Charles entered Sylvia's small apartment, its walls cluttered with photos of her, friends, and a few decorations meant to make the place feel cozy. Sylvia was sitting on the couch with her phone, scrolling through appointments. "Prenatal clinic says they can fit me in next week," she said, not looking up. "You coming with me?" Charles, slouched on the opposite end of the couch, shrugged. "Guess I should, huh?" Sylvia glanced at him. "It's your kid, might as well act like you care." Charles rolled his eyes. "Don't start, Sylvia." Sylvia sighed and stood, stretching lazily. "Whatever. I'm taking a shower. Don't touch my snacks." She disappeared into the bathroom, the sound of water running filling the small apartment. Sitting alone on the couch, Charles leaned back and closed his eyes, but the memories he'd been pushing down surged forward. He clenched his fists, the phantom weight of that night in jail pressing on his chest. It had been brutal, dark, dehumanizing, and something he never wanted to relive, even in thought. The shame and rage clung to him like a second skin. He remembered the blood, the mocking laughter, and the whispers that followed him through the prison corridors afterward. That night had been the first time he'd considered that he might have contracted something. He'd felt the symptoms, the fatigue, the night sweats, but he'd chalked it up to stress and prison conditions. Even now out of jail, he refused to see a doctor, refused to face the truth. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. He glanced toward the bathroom door, Sylvia's humming faintly audible over the water. "Charles!" Sylvia's voice rang out from the bathroom. "Get in here!" Charles sighed, his train of thought broken. "What?" "You know what?" she teased. "Come keep me company." Reluctantly, Charles stood and made his way to the bathroom. Sylvia was behind the steamed-up glass, her silhouette a tempting blur. "You gonna stand there, or are you getting in?" she said, peeking out from behind the door. Charles stripped off his clothes and stepped in, letting the hot water hit his tense shoulders. Sylvia pressed against him, running her hands over his chest. Draped in a towel, Sylvia led Charles to her bedroom. "Lie down," she instructed, grabbing a bottle of oil from her nightstand. Charles stretched out on his stomach, the mattress creaking under his weight. Sylvia climbed onto his back, her hands working the oil into his skin. "You're tense," she murmured, kneading his shoulders. "Yeah," Charles muttered, his face buried in a pillow. As she worked her way down his back, he surprised her by asking, "Can you rub my ass?" Sylvia paused, raising an eyebrow. "Your what?" "My butt," he said flatly. Sylvia chuckled. "That's weird, but okay." She rubbed his lower back and moved to his glutes, her hands hesitating before applying pressure. Charles rolled over suddenly, grabbing her hips and pulling her down onto him. The sex started passionately, but Charles's movements quickly turned rough, almost punishing. Sylvia tried to match his intensity at first, but soon felt overwhelmed. "Charles," she said, her voice strained. "Slow down. He didn't respond, gripping her harder and pushing further. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Charles froze immediately, his breath ragged. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, rolling off her and sitting on the edge of the bed. Sylvia sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. "What the fuck was that?" Charles didn't answer. He pulled on his clothes in silence, avoiding her gaze. "Charles, I gotta go," he said, cutting her off. He grabbed his jacket and left the apartment without another word. The bar was dimly lit, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke filling the air. Charles nursed a whiskey, staring into the amber liquid like it held answers to questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. He replayed the scene with Sylvia in his mind, guilt gnawing at him. He hadn't meant to lose control like that, but the memories of jail and the shame he carried were like a ticking bomb inside him, and Sylvia had been caught in the fallout. He downed his drink and signaled for another, his thoughts spiraling. Back at her apartment, Sylvia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached, but her mind was racing. Charles's behavior had thrown her off, but she rationalized it as him adjusting to life outside. "He's been through a lot," she muttered to herself. "It's just stress." Still, a small voice in the back of her mind nagged at her. Something about the way he'd acted felt wrong. Shaking off the thought, she turned over and closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. The waiting room of the clinic was quiet, filled with the sound of a softly humming air conditioner and the occasional rustle of magazines. Katrina sat alone, her hands resting on her small but noticeable bump. She glanced at her watch, wishing Tony could have been there, but his job didn't allow him much flexibility. Just as she was about to lose herself in her thoughts, the door swung open, and in walked Sylvia. Katrina froze, her heart sinking as their eyes met. Sylvia, dressed in tight leggings and an oversized hoodie that couldn't hide her growing belly, smirked as if she had been waiting for this moment. Katrina looked away, but Sylvia made no effort to keep her presence subtle. She sauntered to the check-in desk, glancing back at Katrina with a knowing smile. As Sylvia sat a few seats away, she started making silent gestures. She rubbed her stomach in exaggerated circles, then pointed subtly toward Katrina. With a smug expression, she mouthed the word Charles. Katrina's face flushed with anger. She straightened in her seat, glaring at Sylvia. She wanted to yell, to tell her to grow up, but the receptionist's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Katrina?" Katrina stood, brushing past Sylvia without a word, but as she entered the exam room, her mind raced. Charles's baby? Really? Despite the tension in the waiting room, Katrina couldn't help but feel a wave of emotion when the doctor placed the Doppler on her stomach. "Do you hear that?" the doctor asked, smiling. The soft, rhythmic sound of her baby's heartbeat filled the room. Tears welled in Katrina's eyes. For a moment, she forgot about Sylvia, Charles, and everything else. This was her baby, her moment. When her appointment ended, she walked out of the room feeling lighter, only to see Sylvia emerging from another exam room down the hall. Sylvia waved, her smug grin returning. "Guess our kids are gonna be cousins, huh?" she said loudly, making a few nurses glance their way. Katrina ignored her and kept walking toward the exit, but Sylvia wasn't done. In the parking lot, Sylvia caught up to Katrina. "Why are you acting all high and mighty?" Sylvia snapped, stepping in front of Katrina's path. "You knew what Charles was like." Katrina turned, her eyes blazing. "And you think having his baby makes you special? You're just another one of his mistakes, Sylvia." Sylvia laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's rich coming from you. At least I don't need another man to step in and play daddy." Katrina's fists clenched. "Tony is more of a man than Charles will ever be." Sylvia tilted her head, smirking. "Then why are you so pressed? You're mad because Charles chose me. He's not coming back to you, Katrina." Katrina's voice dropped, cold and steady. "Charles didn't choose you. He's using you because you let him. And when he gets tired, you'll see what that feels like." Sylvia's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Keep telling yourself that. Meanwhile, I'm the one having his first child." Katrina shook her head, stepping closer. "You think you've won? You don't even know who he really is. Good luck with that, Sylvia." With that, Katrina turned and walked away, leaving Sylvia standing alone, her confidence shaken. Sylvia sat in her apartment, replaying the conversation in her head. Katrina's words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. "You don't even know who he really is." She glanced at her phone, debating whether to text Charles. He hadn't reached out since their last encounter, and she was starting to feel uneasy about his silence. Meanwhile, Katrina was at home, trying to focus on dinner but finding herself lost in thought. She hated that Sylvia still had this hold on her emotions. "I'm with Tony now. Charles doesn't matter." But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. A few months later, Katrina and Tony strolled through the aisles of a baby store, their cart already loaded with tiny onesies, blankets, and toys. Tony held up a pair of baby sneakers, grinning. Look at these, Kat. Our little guy's going to be rocking these before he can even walk. Katrina smiled faintly, trying to match his enthusiasm. Yeah, they're cute. Tony noticed the lack of excitement in her voice. He put the shoes back and turned to her, gently touching her shoulder. What's wrong? You've been quiet all day. She hesitated, not wanting to ruin the moment. I don't know. I guess I thought I'd be more excited about having a boy. I always dreamed of having a girl, you know? Tony nodded, pulling her into a side hug. I get that, but our boy is going to be amazing. He's got you for a mom. Katrina smiled weakly, leaning into him. Tony's words were kind, but they didn't completely ease the nagging sadness in her heart. Across town, Sylvia was in a different baby store, flipping through racks of baby clothes. She was exhausted, her back aching from carrying the weight of her pregnancy, and it felt her relationship with Charles. She had invited him to come along, but as usual, he showed up late and disinterested. He stood by the door, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. Do you like this one? Sylvia asked, holding up a pink onesie with tiny flowers. It's fine, Charles muttered, not even glancing at it. Sylvia sighed, putting it in the cart. She was used to this by now. Charles's lack of involvement had become a pattern. The following week, the neighborhood buzzed with news about Sylvia and Katrina's babies. At the local salon, the women couldn't stop talking about Sylvia's baby girl. Katrina's having a boy, right? One woman said, combing through her client's hair. Yeah, but did you hear Sylvia's having a girl? Another chimed in. A little princess. Katrina happened to walk by as the conversation floated out the open door. She paused, her heart sinking. She hadn't known Sylvia was having a girl. That night, Katrina sat on the couch, her mood heavy. She absently folded baby clothes, her thoughts drifting to Sylvia. She's getting everything I wanted, a girl, Charles. Why does it feel like I'm losing even when I'm trying to move on? Tony came in holding 2 mugs of tea. He sat beside her, placing a hand on her knee. You've been off since this afternoon. Talk to me. Katrina hesitated, then sighed. It's just, I found out Sylvia's having a girl, and it made me feel, I don't know, like she's winning. Tony frowned. Winning? Kat, you've got me. You've got our son on the way. Sylvia doesn't have what you have. Katrina looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. I know you're trying, Tony, but you don't get it. It's not just about Charles or the baby, it's everything. Tony pulled her into his arms, letting her cry. I may not get it all, but I'm here for you, always. A week later, Tony and Charles ran into each other outside a corner store. Charles was leaning against a wall, smoking, while Tony exited the store with a bag of groceries. The 2 men locked eyes, tension crackling between them. Tony, Charles said, exhaling smoke. How's Katrina? Tony stopped, squaring his shoulders. She's good, better than she ever was with you. Charles smirked, pushing off the wall. That right? Funny, considering she still looks at me like she's got unfinished business. Tony stepped closer, his voice low but firm. She's done with you, man, and I'm not about to let you mess with her head again. Charles chuckled, flicking his cigarette to the ground. You're playing house, Tony, but we both know Katrina doesn't really belong to you. Tony clenched his fists, but he held back. You don't know her anymore. She's moved on, and maybe you should focus on your girl instead of worrying about mine. Charles's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. We'll see how long this little fantasy of yours lasts. Tony stepped even closer, his voice hard. If you come near her, we'll have a problem. Stay in your lane, Charles. Charles raised his hands mockingly. Whatever you say, man. As Tony walked away, Charles watched him, a mixture of frustration and jealousy brewing in his chest. Charles was sitting on Sylvia's worn-out couch, scrolling through social media aimlessly, while Sylvia cooked dinner in the kitchen. A notification caught his eye, a picture someone had tagged Tony and Katrina in. The photo was of the 2 of them standing in a baby store, Tony holding up a tiny blue onesie while Katrina laughed, her hand resting on her belly. They looked happy, too happy. Charles's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. What does Tony have that I don't? He thought bitterly. Dinner's almost ready, Sylvia called, breaking his thoughts. He didn't respond, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. His mind was racing. Katrina's smile in that photo stayed with him, gnawing at his pride. Later that night, Sylvia sat on the edge of the bed, watching Charles as he undressed. You've been quiet all day, she said cautiously. Just thinking, he replied, avoiding her gaze. Sylvia frowned. About what? You've been distant lately, Charles. He sighed, sitting on the bed beside her. Look, I told you before, I'll take care of my kid. I'll be there for her. But I don't want to do this with you, Sylvia. Her heart sank, but she masked it with a scoff. Then why are you still here? Why do you keep sleeping with me? Charles rubbed his face, frustration evident. Because I need time to figure things out. Don't act like you don't want me here. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. I do want you here, Charles, but not like this. You're either in or you're out. I'm not going to beg you to be with me. He didn't answer, lying back on the bed and staring at the ceiling. Sylvia turned away, biting her lip to keep from crying. Katrina sat on the edge of her bed, folding tiny baby clothes as the sound of soft 90s R&B played in the background. Tony was in the living room watching TV, giving her space. She had seen the photo someone posted of her and Tony earlier that day. Everyone had commented about how happy they looked, how perfect they seemed together, but Katrina didn't feel perfect. Her mind drifted to Charles. She hated herself for still thinking about him. Why do I care if he's with Sylvia, she thought. The weight of her conflicting emotions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wiped away a tear as Tony walked into the room. Hey, you okay? He asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Katrina nodded quickly, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. Tony didn't believe her, but didn't press. He sat beside her, picking up a tiny pair of socks and smiling. You know, our little guy is going to look so fly in these. Katrina chuckled softly, but her heart wasn't in it. The next day, Charles went to the corner store to grab a pack of cigarettes. As he walked out, he saw Tony and a couple of guys he knew from the neighborhood standing across the street. Tony laughed at something one of the guys said, but what caught Charles's attention was the way Tony carried himself. Confident, relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. Charles crossed the street, his posture tense. "What's up, Tony?" he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. Tony turned, his expression neutral. "Charles." The other guys quickly sensed the tension and made excuses to leave, leaving the two men alone. "I saw that picture of you and Katrina," Charles said, lighting a cigarette. "You playing daddy now?" Tony smirked. "I'm not playing anything. Katrina and I are building something real. You wouldn't understand that." Charles took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than me, huh?" Tony didn't back down. "I don't need to think it. I treat her right, Charles. Something you never could do." Charles's hand twitched at his side, but he forced himself to stay calm. "She's still in love with me, you know. You're just a placeholder." Tony chuckled, shaking his head. "Keep telling yourself that. But if you ever come near her or my son, we're gonna have a problem." Charles blew out a puff of smoke, watching Tony walk away. His resentment deepened, fueling the fire inside him. That night, Sylvia confronted Charles again. "I saw you looking at that picture of Tony and Katrina earlier," she said. Charles didn't deny it. "What about it?" "You're obsessed with her, Charles, and it's affecting everything. You don't even care about this baby." "I care about my daughter," he snapped. "But I never asked for this, Sylvia," her voice cracked. "And I never asked to be your second choice." Charles stood, grabbing his jacket. "I don't need this right now." As he slammed the door behind him, Sylvia broke down in tears. She didn't know how much longer she could do this. Meanwhile, Katrina sat in the nursery she and Tony had started putting together. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a crib stood in the corner. But instead of feeling joy, Katrina felt empty. She stared at her phone, tempted to text Charles, but stopping herself. Tony walked in, noticing her distant expression. "Kat, we need to talk." She looked up, startled. "About what?" Tony sat beside her, taking her hand. "I know you're still thinking about him, and I can't keep pretending it doesn't bother me." Tears filled Katrina's eyes. "I'm sorry, Tony. I'm trying." "I know you are," he said softly, "but I need to know if you're really with me or if you're just waiting for him to come back." Katrina didn't answer, and the silence between them said more than words ever could. Tony turned on the shower, the rush of warm water cascading over his tense muscles. The soft hum of the water against the tiles created a soothing rhythm, but his mind wouldn't quiet. He leaned forward, resting his palms against the shower wall, and let the water stream down his back. Charles's face flashed in his mind, his hollowed cheeks, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his eyes darted around like he couldn't settle. He didn't look right today, Tony thought, frowning. Not like the Charles I know. Where's all that swagger he's always throwing around? He thought back to their encounter earlier on the street. Charles's hostility wasn't new, but something about it today had felt different, off. There was a desperation in his words, in the way he seemed to need to prove something. Tony shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. "Probably just stressed," he muttered to himself, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. He let out a low chuckle as another thought struck him. "I mean, I'd be stressed too if I was stuck with Sylvia." The corner of his mouth twitched into a smirk. Charles had always chased the high-maintenance types, but even he must have known that Sylvia was a mess waiting to happen. She was manipulative, sneaky, and clearly in it for her own gain. Now he's locked in with her and a baby on the way. That's gotta sting. Tony tilted his head back, letting the warm water pour over his face, washing away the day. Serves him right. Maybe this is karma finally catching up to him. But the nagging thought wouldn't leave him alone. Charles's sickly appearance stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of Tony's mind. He thought about how Charles had avoided direct eye contact, the way his voice seemed to lack its usual sharpness. Stress doesn't make you look like that, Tony thought, his smirk fading. He closed his eyes, trying to brush the thought away. Charles was none of his business anymore. Whatever was going on with him, he'd brought it on himself. But still, something didn't sit right. The water began to cool, snapping Tony out of his thoughts. He turned the faucet off, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around his waist. As he stepped out of the bathroom, the tension in his shoulders hadn't eased. Walking into the bedroom, he saw Katrina curled up on the bed, her back to him. The nursery door was still ajar, the soft glow of the baby blue walls spilling into the hallway. Tony sighed, running a hand over his face. He had more important things to worry about than Charles, but even as he crawled into bed next to Katrina, pulling her close, the image of Charles's pale, haunted face lingered in his mind. Something's not right with him. I can feel it. The time had finally come. Katrina lay in the delivery room, gripping the hospital bed rails as waves of pain rippled through her body. The beeping of the monitors and the murmured voices of nurses filled the air, but her mind was elsewhere. She was still reeling from the news. HIV positive. Tears streamed down her face, not just from the physical pain but from the emotional devastation. Beside her, Tony sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. He had said little since they got the news, his silence louder than any words. How could this happen? Katrina whispered, her voice trembling. Tony didn't answer, staring at the floor, his hands balled into fists. Across the hospital, Sylvia was in another delivery room, her body racked with labor pains. Unlike Katrina, she was alone. Charles had been with her earlier but had stepped out, unable to face the tension in the room. When Sylvia had been told she was HIV positive, her first reaction was denial. But as the reality set in, anger took its place. She knew exactly where it had come from. "Charles," she spat under her breath, gripping the sheets as another contraction hit. The nurse beside her tried to soothe her, but Sylvia couldn't focus. Her mind was a storm of rage and grief. Back in Katrina's room, Tony finally broke his silence. "I'm getting tested," he said abruptly, standing and heading for the door. Katrina reached out for him, her voice panicked. "Tony, please, don't leave me right now." "I need to know," he said without looking back, his voice cold. "For me and for the baby." He walked out, leaving Katrina alone with her pain and her guilt. Sylvia's screams echoed through the room as she gave one final push. The silence that followed was deafening. The doctor's face was grim as he held the lifeless body of Sylvia's baby girl. "I'm so sorry, Sylvia. She didn't make it." Sylvia's head fell back against the pillow, her body trembling with sobs. "No, no, no," she wailed, her voice raw with anguish. Charles rushed into the room at the sound of her cries. He froze when he saw the doctor holding the stillborn baby. "I'm sorry for your loss," the doctor said gently before handing the baby to a nurse. Sylvia turned to Charles, her tear-streaked face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," she screamed. Charles's chest tightened, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words. "Sylvia, I didn't know—" "Didn't know what?" she snapped. "That you were sick, that you've been lying to me this whole time?" Charles stepped closer, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to believe it," he admitted. "I found out in jail. I thought maybe it wasn't true." Sylvia stared at him in disbelief. "You knew and you didn't tell me?" Charles dropped his head, shame washing over him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was scared." Sylvia slapped him hard across the face, her voice breaking. "You killed her! You killed my baby!" Charles stood there, his cheeks stinging as Sylvia turned away from him, sobbing uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Katrina gave one final push, and the sound of her baby's cry filled the room. Relief and exhaustion washed over her as the doctor held up a healthy baby boy. "He's perfect," the nurse said, handing the baby to Katrina. But as she looked down at her son, her breath caught in her throat. He had Charles's eyes, Charles's nose. There was no mistaking it. Tony re-entered the room just as the nurse was cleaning up. He froze when he saw the baby. "That's not my son," he said quietly, his voice trembling with anger. "Tony," Katrina started, but he cut her off. "Have you been with Charles while we've been together?" Katrina hesitated, guilt written all over her face. "It was only once." she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I went to see him in jail. Tony's face darkened. And you didn't think to tell me? After everything? I didn't know this would happen, Katrina cried. You didn't know, but you didn't care either, Tony snapped. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Katrina to sob quietly, her baby still in her arms. Sylvia sat in her hospital bed, staring blankly at the wall. She felt hollow, disconnected from everything around her. Charles sat beside her, his head in his hands. Sylvia, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice choked with emotion. She didn't respond, her silence cutting deeper than any words. Across the hospital, Katrina held her baby close, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know how she was going to face Tony or what her future would hold, and Tony sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, his head resting against the steering wheel. His heart felt heavy with betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. When everyone returned home, they set up to take the paternity test. The envelope sat on the table like a loaded gun, its contents ready to destroy what little was left of Tony and Katrina's relationship. They were in the living room, their baby boy asleep in his crib nearby, oblivious to the storm brewing. Tony picked up the envelope with shaky hands, his jaw clenched so tightly that it hurt. Katrina sat across from him, her arms wrapped around herself, tears brimming in her eyes. Do you want me to open it? She whispered. Tony shook his head. No, I need to do it. He tore open the envelope and pulled out the folded paper inside. His eyes scanned the words, the black and white ink sealing his worst fears. The baby was Charles's. Tony dropped the paper onto the coffee table and leaned back, his face a mask of heartbreak. I knew it, he said quietly, his voice trembling. I knew it the second I saw his face. Tony, I'm so sorry, Katrina said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, pain, and betrayal. You didn't mean for it to happen. You went to see him, Katrina. You made a choice. It was one time, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was torn in between the two of you. I didn't think I would get pregnant. Tony stood up, pacing the room. One time is all it takes, and now I've spent months thinking this baby was mine, loving him, planning for him, and it's not even my kid. Katrina buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry, Tony. I really am. I need some air, Tony said, grabbing his coat. I can't be here right now. He walked out, leaving Katrina alone with her guilt and the weight of the truth. That night, after putting the baby to bed, Katrina sat on the couch with her phone in her hand. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant to send the message, but she knew she had to. She typed, Katrina, Charles, the baby is yours, and you need to get tested. I found out I have AIDS. She hit send, her heart pounding as she waited for a response. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. Charles, I already know. I found out in jail. Katrina stared at the screen, her mind racing. Katrina, you knew and you didn't say anything? Charles, I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe they got it wrong. I was scared, Katrina. I didn't know how to tell you. She didn't reply, but another message came through. Charles, Sylvia has it too. She lost the baby because of it. Katrina's breath hitched. She hadn't heard about Sylvia losing her baby. Despite everything, she felt a pang of sadness for her former friend. Charles, I need to tell you something else. Her stomach churned as she read the next text. Charles, the first time you caught me and Sylvia in the kitchen, I knew she drugged your drink. I didn't stop her. I let it happen. Katrina's hands began to shake as she read the words over and over again. Charles, I'm sorry for everything. Katrina sat there in stunned silence, her phone slipping from her hands onto the couch. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Charles had not only betrayed her, but had stood by while Sylvia violated her trust in the worst way. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief. She felt sick to her stomach, her body trembling as the weight of everything came crashing down on her. The baby stirred in the crib, letting out a soft whimper. Katrina wiped her tears and went to him, picking him up and holding him close. He was innocent in all of this, a small piece of light in the darkness surrounding her life. As she rocked him back to sleep, she made a silent vow to protect him from the chaos and toxicity that Charles and Sylvia had brought into her world. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let this cycle of pain and betrayal continue. In the distance, she heard the sound of Tony's car pulling into the driveway. She braced herself for whatever came next. Sylvia sat in the dim light of her apartment, her body frail and her mind spiraling. The crib sat pristine in the corner, empty, mocking her every waking moment. For weeks, she hadn't eaten more than a few bites, nor showered. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with the sound of a baby crying, a cry she could never comfort. She blamed Charles for everything, for the baby she lost, for the disease she now carried, for the life she'd never have. Her anger brewed, bubbling beneath the surface until one day she woke up consumed by it. Her sadness transformed into a fiery rage that burned away her apathy. Sylvia slipped on a hoodie and jeans, her face gaunt and pale as she ventured into the streets. She wandered aimlessly until she found herself at a rundown bar where the air reeked of stale beer and desperation. Inside, she spotted a man known for his shady dealings. His name was Snake, a wiry figure with a reputation for making problems disappear, for the right price. Sylvia approached him, her voice hoarse and low. "I need to talk to you." Snake looked her up and down, his brow furrowing. "You don't look so good, lady. What's this about?" "I need someone gone," Sylvia said bluntly, her eyes void of any hesitation. Snake leaned back, crossing his arms. "You sure about that? Once I start, there's no turning back." Sylvia nodded, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. "He ruined my life. He killed my baby, gave me this—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely to herself. "He deserves worse than death." Snake grinned, a toothy, sinister smile. "All right, but it's gonna cost you." Sylvia hesitated for a moment, realizing she didn't have much left. "I'll pay whatever I can. Just make it happen." As the days passed and she awaited news from Snake, Sylvia found herself spiraling further into despair. The anger had carried her for a moment, but now she felt hollow again. She couldn't stop thinking about her baby, about the life she should have had. One night she found herself back in the neighborhood, wandering aimlessly until she stumbled upon an old acquaintance who was deep in the drug scene. His name was Jax, and he always had a way of making pain disappear, at least temporarily. "Jax," she said, her voice shaky, "I need something, anything to make this stop." Jax looked at her skeptically. "You sure? This stuff ain't for lightweights, Syl." "I don't care," she snapped. "I just need it." He handed her a small bag, his eyes dark with warning. "Be careful with this. It's strong." Sylvia didn't care. She went home, locked herself in her apartment, and let the drugs take her away. The first hit brought an intense, blissful numbness, a quiet she hadn't felt in months, but it didn't last. The high faded, and she was left craving more. Days turned into weeks, and Sylvia fell deeper into her addiction. Her once pristine apartment became a chaotic mess, the crib still sitting untouched but now surrounded by discarded needles and empty bottles. She rarely left the house, her life a blur of highs and crushing lows. Snake hadn't called back, and she started to wonder if the hit on Charles would ever happen. One night, in a drug-fueled haze, Sylvia stared at the crib and screamed, the sound raw and guttural. She grabbed the crib and threw it across the room, the crash echoing in the empty apartment. She sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She had nothing left, no baby, no future, no hope. And it was all Charles's fault. Sylvia vowed through her tears and broken spirit that if Snake didn't come through, she would take matters into her own hands. Charles would pay for what he had done one way or another. Charles took over Sylvia's apartment like it was his birthright. He moved his things in, tossed hers into the corner, and treated it as if it had always been his. The space still carried traces of her, a baby blanket draped over the couch, a half-packed hospital bag in the corner. He ignored it all. Sylvia hadn't been home in weeks, and Charles didn't much care where she was. The apartment was quiet, an escape from the chaos he felt creeping in every time he looked in the mirror or thought too hard about his diagnosis. But deep down, guilt and denial warred within him. He hadn't just ruined his own life, he'd destroyed the lives of everyone around him, yet he still couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge the weight of it. Tony parked his car outside Katrina's building and sat for a moment, staring at the cracked sidewalk. His thoughts drifted back to that shower weeks ago, the moment he started to piece things together about Charles. So that's why he looked like that. Charles had AIDS. Tony felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. Despite everything Charles had done to Katrina and to him, Tony couldn't shake the memory of the man Charles used to be, confident, sharp, and untouchable. When he finally made it upstairs, he found Katrina on the couch, rocking the baby in her arms. Tears streamed down her face, and the sight gutted him. "Katrina," Tony said softly. She didn't look up, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For everything. For messing this up. For loving him." Her shoulders shook as she cried harder. Tony sighed, running a hand over his face. "I need some time, Katrina. I don't know how I'm going to raise somebody else's son." Her sobs turned to silent tears, her body slumping against the couch. "I understand," she whispered. Tony packed his things and moved back into his mom's house. The moment he stepped through the door, his younger brother Marcus greeted him with a joke about moving backward in life. "Big bro, you're really out here doing the boomerang, huh?" Marcus said, grinning. Tony didn't laugh. He dropped his bag by the door and made a beeline for his old room, shutting the door behind him. Lying on his childhood bed, he stared at the ceiling and thought about Katrina. He thought about the baby, about the life he'd tried to build with her, and about Charles. Back in her apartment, Katrina spiraled. The weight of everything crushed her: AIDS, Charles, Tony leaving, the betrayal of her best friend. She felt suffocated by her own thoughts, unable to see a way forward. Every corner of the apartment reminded her of what she had lost. The nursery mocked her with its bright colors and cheerful decorations. One morning, she decided she needed to breathe. Katrina walked to Tony's mom's house, clutching her baby boy to her chest. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. Tony answered, his expression wary. "I just need a couple of hours," she said, her voice trembling. "Please." Tony studied her, noticing the hollows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she held the baby. "All right," he said, taking the baby from her arms. "But Katrina, you don't look good." She nodded weakly, avoiding his gaze. "I'll be back soon." Katrina returned to her empty apartment and sat on the floor in the middle of the living room. She cried, loud and unrestrained, letting the grief and pain pour out of her. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. The weight of her reality pressed down on her, and for the first time she didn't know if she could carry it anymore. In the quiet of the room, Katrina whispered to herself, "I just need to make it stop." Katrina sat on the couch, the gun heavy in her lap. She stared at it, her mind racing. The thought of what she was about to do terrified her, but she couldn't stop herself. Every betrayal, every heartbreak, every piece of her shattered life had led her to this moment. Charles had left the gun in the safe before going to jail, a piece of his reckless past. Now it sat in her hands like the final chapter to everything he'd ruined. She tucked the gun into her bag, grabbed her keys, and walked out of the apartment. When Charles opened the door, he looked worse than ever, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. He barely even flinched when he saw Katrina standing there. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I need to talk to you." "About our son," Katrina replied, her voice surprisingly steady. Charles glanced over his shoulder into the apartment. It was a mess. Sylvia's things were still scattered everywhere, and the air reeked of old food and despair. "She's not here," Charles said, interpreting her glance. "Sylvia's been gone for weeks. She got hooked on something. I don't even know where she is anymore." Katrina nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say. "Can we talk in the car?" she asked. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I just want privacy, to figure out how we're going to co-parent, to keep our son safe from this disease," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. Charles hesitated but eventually shrugged. "All right." Charles climbed into the passenger seat, adjusting his hoodie as Katrina started the car. She didn't drive, just parked there with the engine idling. "So," Charles said, glancing at her, "what's the plan?" Katrina gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "I've been thinking," she began. "We need to be careful. With our son. He didn't ask for any of this." Charles nodded, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, you're right. I think we need to have boundaries," she continued. "Clear rules, no surprises." "Sure," Charles said. "That makes sense." Katrina reached behind the passenger seat, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the gun. Her heart pounded as she pulled it out, her hand trembling. Charles froze, his eyes widening as he saw the weapon. "Katrina? What are you doing?" Tears streamed down her face as she pointed the gun at him. "You ruined everything," she whispered. "Katrina, put the gun down," Charles said, his voice low and calm. "Think about our son." A deafening shot cut him off, his head snapping back as blood splattered across the car. Katrina gasped, dropping the gun onto her lap. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she stared at Charles's lifeless body slumped in the seat. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What have I done?" The weight of her actions crushed her, and a numbness overtook her. Without thinking, she picked up the gun again, her hands steady this time. "Can't do this anymore," she murmured to herself. She raised the gun to her temple, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The sound of 2 gunshots echoed through the neighborhood. Residents rushed outside, their eyes drawn to the car parked on the street. People began to gather, whispering and pointing, trying to make sense of the scene. Blood streaked the inside of the car, and the sight of 2 lifeless bodies sent shockwaves through the crowd. Someone called the police. Tony was at his mom's house when his phone buzzed. A neighbor from Katrina's block had texted him about the commotion, saying something about police swarming the area. His stomach dropped. He left immediately, not even bothering to explain where he was going. When he arrived, the sight of the car and the flashing lights of the police made his heart pound. He pushed through the crowd, desperate to see what had happened. Then he saw them, Katrina, Charles, both gone. Tony stumbled back, his knees buckling. "No!" he whispered, his voice breaking. As the reality sank in, Tony collapsed onto the curb, tears streaming down his face. The weight of everything crushed him: Katrina's pain, Charles's destruction, and the innocent life caught in the middle. The baby, their son, was still with his mom. Tony swore he would protect the boy with everything he had, but the scars of this tragedy would never fade. Tony becomes a single father. That takes treatment for AIDS.